welcome back to Sahara TV, and I'm Chika Odua. We're continuing our country focus at this moment. We just spoke with Mr. Chris Zambakari, and we had very interesting Skype calls. We're going to go back and talk with a young lady. She's a public health specialist. Right now, she is in Nairobi, Kenya. She is of South Sudanese descent. Her name is Juliana Bol. Thank you so much, Juliana, for joining us on Sahara TV.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Great. So just to clarify, for those who are just joining us, South Sudan is celebrating its 1 full year of independence from Sudan, and this is a negotiation of a peace deal that was brokered in 2005. And last year, an overwhelming majority of South Sudanese people voted in a referendum vote to break away from Sudan. So South Sudan is the newest country in Africa after Eritrea won its independence from Ethiopia in 1993. So we just want to jump right into it. So you are from South Sudan, and can you just give us, what's your ethnic background?
My father, who passed away in 1984, was Dinka from northern Bargazal, and my mother is a Choli from eastern Equatoria. So I kind of straddle both ends of South Sudan.
Right. And I understand that there are maybe about 4 major tribes, ethnic groups in South Sudan, including the Dinka and the Arabic and many others. So do you think that in South Sudan, now that it has its own independence, is it united ethnically, culturally? What do you have to say about the unity in South Sudan?
I think it takes a long time for a country to develop an identity. Of a national identity. So I think right now most people's identities are very much tribal based. So a lot of the issues currently in South Sudan are intertribal hostilities that have been carried out from the past and that are currently being still experienced within the country. So you have a lot of conflicts, for example, between the Nuer and the Dinka, the Murle and the Dinka, or the different tribes having different conflicts. I think it's going to take quite a long time before we as South Sudanese develop what we call a national identity as opposed to our tribal-based identities. I think it also doesn't help that a lot of the hostilities are being, I guess, made worse by the fact that there's a lot of ammunition. A lot of people have guns and ammunition left over from the war. So it's a cycle of violence that I think will continue for some time.
Mm-hmm. And also the president himself, Mr. Salva Kiir, he's a Dinka. Do you think that non-Dinkas are pleased with his performance thus far?
I think Salva has done a pretty good job in terms of trying to sort of, bring different tribes together, especially coming after the death of John Garang. But a lot of the issues that are being experienced in the country, I think, might be a little bit out of his control. Of course, the Dinkas are the majority tribe in the country, and I feel like a lot of us come, to South Sudan with or approach independence with the mentality that, it's now time for us to sort of bear the fruits of independence, and unfortunately that sometimes means that we are not necessarily dealing fairly with other tribes or other communities. So I'm not necessarily sure that we can necessarily blame one person. I think it's a whole cultural mindset that needs to change.
Mm-hmm. And just give us some more background information on yourself. I understand that you were raised in Kenya, but how much experience do you have living in what is now South Sudan? As we understand, South Sudan was carved out of the 10 southernmost regions in Sudan. So do you have any experience living in these areas? So I grew up in Kenya. My first time actually going to South Sudan was in 2008 when I spent 3 months in Lake State, Rumbek. And then came back in August 2009 and have lived there since then. So I've visited almost all the states in South Sudan, but I think coming in as somebody who's, from the diaspora, obviously I'm in a way also trying to learn what my cultural or what my identity is in South Sudan. And so it's an ongoing thing with me as well. Mm-hmm. And Juliana, I understand that the 2005 peace deal negotiated an end to Africa's longest running civil war. And we've seen the images for so many years. We saw the pictures, we saw the videos, and we heard the stories of torture where many people who are now from South Sudan were pretty much discriminated and crucified, their families, their animals slaughtered, the girls raped, mass genocide into the neighboring countries. Can you share any personal experiences on how the Sudanese civil war affected your own family? in a way, I was lucky because I grew up in Kenya, but my uncles and aunts actually came back to South Sudan in the 80s when there was a bit of a lull in the war. But then towards the late 80s, it got really bad in the Eastern Equatoria part of the country. Some of it being the LRA, some of it being the SPLA, some of it being the South Army, and so they had to flee from Bajok, which is our hometown, and flee to Uganda, and were refugees in Uganda for a number of years before we actually heard anything about. Essentially, we didn't know where they were, and so when we found out where they were, my mother went and got them and was lucky enough to bring them to Nairobi. So that's essentially one way in which I could say the war did touch my family, in the sense that my uncles and aunts had to flee to go to Uganda, stay in Kitgum and Adjumani camps in Uganda.
How about any friends? Did they have, of course, they lost their relatives, maybe they lost their property, their businesses. I understand that many Dinkas living in the north, their businesses were destroyed, burned down, and they were forced to migrate back to their ancestral homelands in the south.
So I can't personally speak about that because I haven't experienced that. As I said before, the only instance where the war really did touch my family was when they had to flee to go to Uganda. In terms of some of the other things you're speaking about, I can't personally speak on it.
Okay. Well, how about just a sense of the vision of the people? Do you have any sort of idea on what the people want moving forward? There was a very popular news story that came out maybe a few weeks ago where the president, Salva Kiir, was demanding for $6 million to be returned, and it turns out that politicians were stealing money. So do you think that South Sudan will fall the way of so many other African countries that are ripped by, in the grip of corruption?
So I feel like you've asked me two questions. What is the sense of people in South Sudan? I think for most of us, actually having a nationality is extremely important. Most of us growing up in Kenya, not really being Kenyan, not having some sort of national identity, not having access to a passport. Those of us who went to the U.S. as refugees and who are now permanent residents or Americans, the sense of actually coming back to a country that is yours and you have ownership over is extremely important. And I think coming from the war, we're all extremely optimistic in terms of the many promises that the SPLA, SPLM movement many promises were made right before, leading up to the referendum, in terms of, access to healthcare, access to education, better standards of living, security. And one of the frustrations currently is that, things are changing a little bit too slowly. There are a lot of stories, instances of insecurity still happening. Not enough has been done in terms of providing access to healthcare, providing free education to the majority of people. And, looking at this also in terms of the way of the stories we hear about, politicians having taken or money having been lost that was meant for this, that, or the other, it's actually an extremely frustrating and frustrating thing, and something that was, I think, none of us really did expect. In terms of, do I feel that we're moving in the wrong direction? I would have to say yes, just because there's so much money that has been misappropriated. There is not enough accountability within the government. It's getting better, but it's not where it should be.
Right.
I also I'm not quite sure what most of our politicians are thinking in terms of the long-term plan for the country. I think I have a sense that people sort of feel like we're not sure how long, and it was before the referendum, we're not sure how long the country will be peaceful, so let's grab and take as much as we can now. Right after independence, Salva did speak about, a lot more accountability. He did speak about having some projects that were, going to be run by the government. But in terms of the results, I think we're still waiting for the results. And I want to be optimistic and say that things will be, will be great. The promises that were made will be met. But we have to wait and see. It's a bit of a difficult time to tell.
So you're saying that the country is going the wrong direction. So in its one full year of independence, has any progress been made, in your opinion?
I think there has been some progress. I mean, there are a lot more children going to schools. There's a lot more access to primary health care facilities. People actually have medications to deal with illnesses and stuff. So you can say that there has been progress made. But I have a sense that we have had such a great opportunity to do much more, and we could have done much more. And unfortunately,
even though we have progressed, we have not progressed as far as we could have if there had been accountability and a greater sense of responsibility in terms of meeting the needs of the South Sudanese people.
Okay, Juliana, I want to talk more about your work. I understand that you attended the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where you studied chemistry, and now you're in the public health sector. Why the switch?
So I graduated from UNC Chapel Hill in 2004, and around 2005, there was all this talk about the CPA and peace potentially coming to South Sudan. So I did start thinking about wanting to come back and work in South Sudan, and sort of felt like chemistry would not be, there wouldn't be as many opportunities with a chemistry degree in South Sudan as potentially public health. I just felt that given the context and the needs in the country, public health might be a better opportunity in terms of trying to better the lives of people in South Sudan. So that was my main reason for going to Colombia.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. So you made a conscious decision to kind of steer your career path based on the needs of the people back home.
Based on a sense of coming home, maybe a little bit romanticizing, the notion of what home is, growing up in Kenya and always knowing I'm from South Sudan, but never having been there. The opportunity to actually go there and essentially, I say romanticize because I had a sense that I would go in and totally fit in, knowing that, when you're outside of a country for a long time, you do change fundamentally, and you're different from, people who have been in the country. So for me, it was more a notion of, trying to find where home is. And trying to find where home is and trying to sort of rebuild, create a foundation there. So a bit of a romantic notion. After these 2 years in South Sudan, a bit more realistic.
So in your field of public health, what are some of the issues on ground in South Sudan that need immediate attention? For me, my passion is maternal health, and I think there's still too few women delivering in health facilities. Some of those are because of cultural issues and beliefs. Some of those are because the health facilities are too far. Mm-hmm. If you're pregnant, you cannot walk, 5 hours, 7 hours to the health facility. And some of them are also that we don't have enough trained, skilled health workers. So maternal mortality is still a big, significant problem in South Sudan, and this is one area that I feel needs a lot of work. However, it's also hard to even realistically imagine how to provide those services because the country is very huge. Populations are very scattered. In terms of resources, it would be almost impossible to provide health facilities everywhere that they're needed. So it's how do you provide access to the health facilities for women who need it, or for children who need it, when the facilities are too far. So are you working with the government to provide more facilities, or is this an independent work of yours?
Pardon?
So are you trying to work and collaborate with the government, or are you more so independent and trying to provide or advocate for more facilities in South Sudan?
So the NGOs work with the Ministry of Health, and currently what the NGOs do is support the existing health facilities. In terms of building new health facilities and infrastructural projects, those are really the mandate of the government. So, what we do is try to provide the services at the facilities, try to train the health workers, try to encourage the communities to come to the health facilities, but also understand that there are some challenges that we cannot overcome. If the distance is too far, there's very little we can do to narrow that gap, unless we do build or construct a facility there. However, resources are limited, so it's trying to work with what you have while trying to improve quality of health service delivery.
Right. Okay, just one final thought from you. What is your goal for South Sudan moving forward? How can the people try to rise from the ashes of the past?
That is a very difficult question.
Well, because let me just kind of put some history and context behind it. For example, in the United States, with the Civil War, African Americans had to find a way to break away from the memory of slavery, but still honor its past. But of course, those wounds were there, those scars were there, and oppressed people around the world have to find a way to remember the past, but not get so wallowed in the memories of the past. So how do you think that the people of South Sudan can move forward?
I think most of us in South Sudan, we experience really fundamental issues, access, lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to education, insecurity. And I think, one thing that would make a difference, sort of looking at post-Civil War, seeing a difference in people's lives. And so this difference can only happen if communities actually see that their lives are improving in certain ways. They have access to clean water, they have access to health facilities, they have access to education. There's an improvement in insecurity issues. There's roads being built. Those are very, I think, material things that people want to see, and I think that's essentially the only way that we can overcome some of our historical memory. But that's a long-term project. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's not going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. So in the short run, I would love to see South Sudanese people actually develop a national identity. But again, that's something that is difficult to do.
Right.
I think there's so many challenges in South Sudan that it's such a difficult question to sort of respond to. There's what we wish to see, but this can only happen given time. And we're only a year old. I think things might get worse before they get better, and we have to strengthen our resolve to accept and understand that, and hopefully work towards a better future.
But that better future is oftentimes the work of the young people. So do you see hope in the future of Sudanese youth, South Sudanese youth? Do you see young activists and teachers and young people who are passionate for change? Do you see that presently in the youth generation?
I do see it, and especially in people coming back and taking up positions, jobs, and trying to do business. There's a lot of optimism among the youth population in South Sudan, and I think that optimism is what is going to carry us through. But there's also elements of people coming back to South Sudan because they want to make money, they want to reap the benefits of the war. So it's a bit of two sides of the same coin. There's the significant population who are really optimistic and trying to access, different resources and trying to sort of improve their well-being and the well-being of their communities. But in hand with that too are those elements who are also coming in to just sort of reap the benefit. But overall, I am optimistic. I think, people like me coming back, a lot of people that are coming back from the diaspora, working in the communities and meeting young people who are working very hard to try to improve their welfare and their well-being. It gives me a sense of hope.
Wow, great. Well, thank you so much. And on that note, I just want to thank you for coming on Sahara TV and giving us your very important insights. And I think it's great to hear from someone like yourself. As you say, you're part of the diaspora community. But again, you've gone back to try to contribute to the progress of your people. Thank you so much for joining us, Juliana.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. Take care. Right, everyone, that was Miss Juliana Bol. She's a public health specialist, and she lives in Juba also, as well as in Nairobi, Kenya. And she was joining us via Skype from Nairobi, where she gave us some insights on how South Sudan can move forward and build its national identity as the people celebrate its one-year anniversary on Monday. Stay tuned on Sahara TV. I'm Chika Ojo. We'll have more for you coming up next. Thank you.